Prague, late spring 1968. Cafes on Narodny carry the muted clink of porcelain and the low timbre of conversations that would have sounded reckless a year before. Newsstands sell papers with cautious editorials about reform, and evening trams deposit students who linger on bridges longer than the weather requires, testing which thoughts can live outside the privacy of a kitchen. The season looks ordinary from a distance. Workday schedules, orderly queues, a city that keeps time, but there is a gentle loosening, like a window left unlatched in a draft. This program presents a speculative reconstruction grounded in public records, press bulletins, and contemporaneous witness accounts. It does not claim final authority, and it avoids confidential material. We follow what can be inferred from parliamentary minutes, selected newspaper runs, broadcast logs, and the rhythm of daily life as it appeared to those who moved through it. The tone is restrained, the voices remain unnamed. What is shown values probability over certainty and leans on details that fit the era. The smell of coal dust after rain, the ritual of carrying coins for the cloakroom, the careful language of an official announcement, read at the top of the hour. In this frame, hope does not stride. It tests the ground with each step. The question is not whether change will triumph, but whether the city's measured tempo can hold when heavier instruments begin to play nearby. We proceed in sequence, keeping to the months as they unfolded, and we let the record suggest, rather than declare, what might have been intended behind closed doors. The first signal is small enough to miss. A book that had been pulled from a shelf returns to a shop window along Spalina Street. A clerk positions it without hurry, as if the gesture helps nobody and offends nobody. In May 1968, the city's routines look familiar. Clerks sweep thresholds at dawn, office workers trade brief nods, and families occupy the same tables in the same cafes they have used for years. Yet the words in the morning paper grow a touch more direct. An editorial proposes that public debate, if kept within bounds, may strengthen rather than weaken the fabric of the state. The phrasing is careful, the argument hedged, and the counterpoint, loyalty to allied commitments, repeated often. Listeners mark the difference anyway. In universities, lecture halls become venues for measured discussions that had once been crowded into private apartments. Professors speak in a tone that suggests permission without naming it. Students keep their notebooks open longer than the bell requires. Nothing looks dramatic. The rhythm of the capital remains that of a city that must work tomorrow. But when a reform pledge reaches the evening broadcast, phrased with caution, acknowledging obligations beyond the frontier while hinting at space for civic trust, the city takes one slow step forward. Two indicators appear in the record that month. The first is a set of meeting notes in which the phrase "broadening public dialogue" is entered, crossed out, and entered again with softer words. The second is a press schedule that adds a late-night slot for culture and society, a slot that had not existed in winter. These are small items, but they have weight in a place that measures change by the thickness of margins. In offices, clerks try out phrases they would have circled last year and decide, after a pause, to leave them in. In cafes off Wenceslas Square, the ritual becomes predictable. A listener lowers a voice. Someone glances at the door, and then the conversation continues at the same volume. An almost theatrical refusal to acknowledge risk. The city's surfaces carry their usual signs: tram timetables, price lists, a poster for a theater revival. But the atmosphere acquires an element of near permission. People do not declare a new era. They test how far the old one has loosened. A phrase begins to travel, governance with a human face. It is rarely defined and therefore easier to carry. Some suspect the phrase will be tolerated as long as it floats above particulars. Others think particulars are the only things that matter. On the street, police presence remains steady but not emphatic. Uniforms adopt the stance of officials who have been told that patience is prudent. A civil servant on a lunch break reads a column about economic adjustments and circles a sentence that promises gradual modernization, then folds the paper carefully, half convinced the sentence will be gone in the afternoon edition. A librarian moves a stack of journals from a locked cabinet to an open shelf and notes that no one complains. The feeling is not elation. It is the earned skepticism of a city that has rehearsed caution and now tries to remember the steps of another dance without music. Those who argue for patience keep their examples practical. Fewer obstacles in the workplace, fewer edits in a local paper. Those who argue that change must move faster cite a mood rather than doctrine, as if policy can hitch a ride on sentiment. The leadership speaks in a grammar of increments, proposing revisions that can be defended as administrative housekeeping rather than a shift in direction. It is possible on a calm evening by the river to imagine that such increments might accumulate into something solid. It is also possible to imagine that they will be collected, examined, and returned to the shelf. The city learns to hold both views in one hand. As spring advances, the capital's calm takes on a paradoxical edge, like the hush in a theater before someone coughs. The quiet is not empty. It is charged with the knowledge that larger circles are watching, and that the pace of a small city's hope is often set elsewhere. Men and women who have kept diaries for years write more in May, then tear out a page, then write again. The tram bells ring with their usual finality. The river moves at its usual speed. But the language of possibility has entered the public day, and once in, it is difficult to escort back out. Menjelang the close of an overlong meeting in a municipal office, attention shifts to a short agenda where the last item, external consultations, waits for signatures that will guide the next step. Summer presses in, and with it the habit of scanning the border of the newspaper before the headline. By June, the capital has learned a new rhythm, outward normality paired with a second life of rumor. In the railway corridors near the periphery, travelers describe hearing engines at hours that sit uneasily with posted schedules. A lorry driver mentions long, covered columns moving at night on roads that do not favor tourism. He puts it plainly and with no flourish, he is not a storyteller by profession and has nothing to sell. Official replies, when they come, are equal in their plainness: joint exercises, routine deployments, no change in the status of obligations, continued fraternity. The phrasing is predictable, but calming enough to pass from neighbor to neighbor without the need for more. The city, in return, tries to keep to its compact with order. Schools hold examinations, theaters play to steady houses, and the commemorations that mark late summer keep their dates. Yet, a second pair of indicators begins to appear in material that will later sit in archives. One is a border report that includes a note about increased transit checks, with no cause assigned. The note is neither accusatory nor apologetic, and it sits like a pebble in a boot. The other is a set of internal bulletins adding additional time to external liaison meetings, as if the agenda needed a longer table. None of this proves anything on its own. It only describes a city that has started to listen past its own walls. In districts near the frontier, the sound changes, low, extended, not quite continuous, something that could be thunder if the sky agreed. Farmers look up from fields and then down again, deciding a glance is enough. At petrol stations on the long roads, attendants tell stories that go no further than the payment window. A pattern emerges in negative space. When a visiting official speaks of unity and solidarity, he emphasizes that reforms are an internal affair. When he leaves the podium, the sentence that remains in the air is the one about unity. In cafes, the phrase "within the framework" becomes a hinge on which conversations open and close. It can mean almost anything. For students who adopted the spring's vocabulary, it means the promise of civic space if rules are observed. For those with longer memories, it means the rules declare their ownership of the space. People begin to align their errands with the radio. It becomes the habit to listen at the top of each hour and then again before sleep. The voice that reads the national news sounds patient, perhaps intentionally so. Commentaries move with care, circling verbs that suggest adjustment rather than divergence. Underneath the language lies the math of geography and power, and everyone knows it, even if it is not spoken. Conversations pause at certain words, and ashtrays fill faster when those words appear. Against this quiet engineering of mood, daily life does not stop. Markets open, laundry is hung, and children play games that sound the same in every decade. People hold both realities in view because ignoring either would be imprudent. By late July, a diplomat's visit provokes lines at a kiosk that sells the more daring journals. A headline speaks in code about pace and alignment, terms designed to fit easily into any conclusion. The city's modest liberalization continues in gestures, a panel discussion that runs 10 minutes long, a poem that keeps one metaphor that would have been cut in spring. But these gestures feel provisional. Those seated at conference tables arrange small flags and distribute agendas that list coordination as the first order of business, followed by mutual understanding as the second. The minutes are precise about attendance, less precise about tone. If one listens closely, there's a new habit of disclaimers, an assurance that loyalty is absolute before any practical item is considered. This habit reassures some and troubles others. At the outer edges of the map, work crews notice scuffed verges and ask no questions. Truck stops grow busier in the small hours. The rumor machine becomes a kind of background weather. Everyone feels it. No one claims to predict it, yet the city keeps to its lanes. The stutter of a printing press on a side street seems louder, possibly because listeners give it space. And then the unremarkable becomes difficult to ignore. A long convoy is sighted after midnight, and the account appears in a letter that will later be saved. It is not proof of anything except travel, but travel itself accumulates meaning when repeated. The sense that decisions are being weighed elsewhere grows sharper. The summer does not break, it tightens. A municipal clerk carries a folio from one office to another and notices that a calendar has been turned a week early, as if someone wanted the month to move faster. He leaves the folio and walks back slowly, measuring the corridor's length by the number of window panes. In this balance between routine and rumor, the capital prepares for nothing and therefore for everything. Menjelang the late-night broadcast on an otherwise quiet Tuesday, attention shifts to the table where the external news wire begins to tap, one code at a time, onto the strip that will be read aloud next. It begins in fragments that do not at first cohere. Shortly after midnight in August 1968, someone who works near a freight yard hears an engine that should not be there and decides it is a scheduling error. A few minutes later, a post office clerk on the late shift notices a lull in long-distance lines, followed by a surge, as if calls were funneling through fewer paths. None of this is extraordinary. Cities at night make noises that day schedules cannot explain. But when a broadcasting assistant walks to the studio and finds a colleague already waiting at a time when the schedule shows no need, he feels the air thicken. The first clear confirmation for the capital arrives as a short item on a foreign service, then another, then a repetition with more definite verbs. Units have crossed borders. The words are chosen with care, but their direction is unambiguous. In apartments across the city, radios are turned down rather than up, a reflex learned from years of listening without drawing notice. Families dress more fully than the heat requires. Those who must be on the street step into stairwells and evaluate the night before committing to it. The city's shape becomes audible, the river, the bridges, the long avenues that function like funnels. If convoy movement is underway, it will follow the geometry that the streets dictate. Soon there are eyes on the embankments and at corners where the road widens to fit a square. The streets do not fill. They gather witnesses. Above, aircraft pass at intervals that are not routine. In the studio, the discussion turns to wording. Announce or wait. Calm or describe. Use the vocabulary of alliance or the vocabulary of intrusion. These are not abstract questions. Each word carries a potential consequence measured in minutes. Two indicators will later help frame the timeline. One is a night log from a news desk that shows multiple attempts to confirm a single sentence before it is read. The other is a short entry in a municipal register noting that several officials cannot be reached and asking that messages be left at their offices. None of this settles intention, but it maps the confusion with care. On the ground, the first vehicles appear where one would expect them. They do not look hurried because they do not need to be. The city does not contest with arms. It responds with a choreography of observation and obstruction that has not yet been practiced. Some residents move to block intersections with their bodies, but most simply stand, as if to present the fact of their presence. The faces on both sides are young, more often than not, and the distance between them is measured not only in meters, but in explanations neither can provide to the other. A driver stops at a corner where the road narrows, consults a paper whose lines are too bold to be street names, and proceeds. The city's signs become a language to be translated in real time. In a few places, markers are rotated or removed. These gestures are local and tentative, the acts of people who prefer misdirection to confrontation. Some succeed for minutes, which feel generous at that hour. In offices where the lights burn late, telephones ring into empty rooms. Messages are written on slips and placed under blotters because the intended readers are not at their desks. A few instructions are issued over official channels. They emphasize calm and order. They avoid verbs that suggest resistance and prefer those that ask for patience. The tone could be read as prudence or as paralysis. In the moment, it is only the words that are available. The city's institutions persist in their habits. A tram operates, then stops, then operates again. Newspaper editors gather, compare what has arrived over the wire, and remove pieces that would add noise without adding clarity. The first daylight finds the capital alert, but not chaotic, which is a kind of discipline. Crowds form where the routes converge, and the logic of the morning commute meets the logic of a presence that is both visible and unexplained. Signs appear in handwriting, some brisk and neat, others produced in haste. They ask for respect, for restraint, for time. Many of the young men in uniform look as though they have not slept. Their equipment is clean in a way that suggests preparation for a display rather than a contest. The city tries language. It speaks without a single voice, but the tones harmonize more often than not. Appeals to conscience are pinned to lampposts. Appeals to procedure are delivered to those who might be in a position to pause a movement by a few meters or a few minutes. Each pause is a victory of scale, visible to those who are close enough to witness it and invisible to the map where routes are marked with arrows. The capital, which had learned restraint the hard way, commits to it again. This arises less from strategy than from a credible reading of available options. Some say that instruction for nonviolence reaches the airwaves within hours. Others remember only a rumor that such an instruction had been discussed. The difference hardly matters on the street. People choose to stand rather than to strike. The day advances, and with it the sense that what began at night will not be reversed before evening. Offices open because offices always open. Cafes serve because that is their utility. In many places, service is slow because staff keep leaving the counter to look at the street, then returning to finish the task, then leaving again. To document the day would require a page for every corner. Some corners would hold little more than a line of onlookers and quiet, and some would hold gestures that resemble negotiation. The city carries both. As afternoon approaches, the narrative tightens to the space in front of a ministry where the crowd's density increases and the first serious standoff of the day begins to develop. And from this pressure, the next scene takes its shape. The standoff grows from silence, not from a shout. By late morning, the avenue in front of the ministry is a corridor of human intent set against a corridor of metal weight. Office workers on their lunch break stand shoulder to shoulder with students who have not decided whether to return to class. Older residents who have measured other years by other arrivals maintain a steady presence a few rows back, watching carefully, supplying steadiness by example. The crowd's language is visible rather than loud. Hand-painted signs borne at chest height, a raised palm to slow a vehicle by a pace or two, a line of bodies that suggests a boundary without establishing one in law. The men in uniform at the front of the convoy keep their gaze forward and slightly above the faces before them, not out of disdain, but because direct eye contact makes their posture harder to hold. No order is announced. The scene behaves as if several orders are being weighed at once. The press of bodies narrows the street, and the flanks of the formation ease toward the curb with a kind of incremental movement that reduces pressure without inviting it. A student with ink on his fingers holds a sheet of paper, high enough for those in the first vehicle to read. The sheet is not a manifesto, only a short appeal to pause until a meeting can be arranged inside the building. Whether the driver reads it is unclear. The vehicle rolls forward by the width of a boot, then stops, then rolls again. A woman carrying a shopping bag takes 2 steps into the lane, looks at the nearest soldier, nods once, then steps back. The city is practicing a grammar of non-escalation, and it falters only when people forget the next word. The failure is brief because someone nearby remembers it. The air contains 2 sounds, the resonance of idling engines and the layered murmur of many people speaking softly at once about practical things. If there are slogans, they are short and tired quickly, replaced by instructions that travel from mouth to mouth about where to stand, where to leave space for an ambulance if one should arrive, where to collect papers that blow loose. 2 items in the day's material will later help fix this moment. One is a police incident sheet that lists crowd management without dispersal as the status at the relevant intersection. It names no injuries and no detentions during the hour recorded. The other is a marginal note in a ministry diary, written in a different hand from the main entries, that reads only, "Delegation expected, external route blocked. Seek alternate entry." Neither sheet speaks of purpose. Both speak of process. Midday advances, and with it the necessity of choosing a shape for the afternoon. Someone suggests that the crowd thin for one tram to pass. Someone else suggests that the tram remain a visible claim that the city's day continues. The compromise arrives without debate. The tram bell sounds, the front ranks breathe, and a space opens that is exactly tram-wide. The vehicle slides through, and the space closes as if it had never opened. The convoy does not move. A junior official appears at a doorway and looks for a superior to speak with, then disappears again. The crowd understands this gesture. It has lived long with doorways that hold decisions not yet made. In side streets, smaller confrontations repeat the pattern. A vehicle turns down a narrow road and meets a knot of residents who do not use force, but do not make way. Paper signs point to dead ends that are not dead ends. Street names are covered in places where they can be reached by hand. These acts are neither heroic nor trivial. They serve the city's decision to contest time and direction without contesting possession. The men in uniform begin to show the fatigue of standing still in heavy clothing on a warming day. A few accept water, none accept food while others watch. This seems to be a rule that has not been spoken aloud. In the ministry, phones connect and disconnect. A tentative schedule for a meeting forms on the last page of a notepad, attached to a hope that procedures might reassert themselves. Those who built careers on the safe use of protocol reach for it now as the only acceptable language left to them. They craft sentences that do not accuse and do not concede, and they plan to read them in a room where chairs have been set exactly as they were for the previous week's briefing. Yet the door to that room is currently hard to reach. Outside, a momentum of restraint holds because no more useful momentum presents itself. The city understands that a single injury would change the temperature of the day in a way that cannot be unwound. When a loud sound does intrude, a misjudged gear shift, a dropped object, the crowd stiffens as one organism, then relaxes again when nothing follows. The afternoon light becomes clinical, showing the scene without romance, pale faces, dark uniforms, paper signs going limp in humidity. A group of teachers begins to collect the younger students and draw them back a block, not to remove them from history, but to place them where they can witness it without being crushed if the lines move. They use the calm, steady tone that has worked in classrooms for years. The line holds. After an hour, the front vehicle inches forward with a deliberation that signals neither retreat nor charge. And the crowd, reading the movement as a test, shifts by a step and no more. The minute hand moves. The day is spent in these trades. At one point, a passage opens along the building wall to allow a small delegation to reach a side entry. This motion is neither victory nor loss. It is a wedge that allows talk to begin where talk had been absent. The crowd holds its position after the delegation disappears because holding position is the only understandable instruction available to civilians who do not claim rank. The mutual decision not to break the line becomes, for that hour, the most important policy in the city. By late afternoon, the sense grows that the scene cannot remain in suspension. Either the formation will be redirected by order, or it will resume movement with the crowd forced apart. There is no vote on this. What follows is the arithmetic of pressure. The front ranks shift backward by a half step, not from fear, but to make room for the kind of decision that, when it comes, will need room. A draft of air moves down the avenue as the heat begins to ease. The crowd's endurance meets the convoy's endurance, and the meeting yields only the knowledge that both sides can hold longer than many had guessed. As the evening hour approaches, a notice is said to have circulated that an internal address may be attempted at a central broadcasting office, and if it is permitted, the city's attention will tilt toward that door in the next scene. The transition arrives without spectacle. Night falls, meetings convene, and sentences are crafted with a precision that conceals disagreement. The next morning looks like any other, except that several names no longer appear where they used to in schedules and on door plates. Words that had moved freely in spring now travel in reduced lanes. Announcements refer to normalization, a term whose meaning is not explained but whose practical effects are felt quickly. The public face remains calm, instructional, and bound to the language of continuity. The private mood takes its guidance from changes in personnel, operating rules, and the steady arrival of notices whose phrasing suggests an administrative correction rather than a reversal. It is not spectacular, and in the city, that is how decisive things are often done. Two items will later serve as markers. One is an internal roster showing reassignment of several department heads to advisory roles with no timetable, a reclassification that creates distance between decision and actor. The second is a broadcast schedule revision that restores earlier programming blocks and removes the late-night culture and society slot that had been added in May. These are not banners so much as switches toggled back to their original positions. In offices, people learn again the old habit of weighing each sentence before it leaves the mouth. Letters are written in a hand that leaves more space between words than necessary, as if air were needed to carry them safely across the desk. In cafes, conversations continue in the manner established in spring, then downshift without a cue, like a car approaching a hill. The city is not silenced, it is detuned. The first weeks pass in a state of managed ambiguity. Public events take place under supervision that does not announce itself loudly, but always arrives early. The difference between permission and tolerance becomes more than semantic. At workplaces, committees that had formed to discuss improvements dissolve without a vote, replaced by familiar chains of sign-off that return decisions to higher levels. Those who had urged patience in spring now use the same word to justify pause. The concept of a human face returns to the shelf from which it had been taken, not torn or defaced, merely placed out of reach. The street presence of foreign units grows more matter-of-fact. Checkpoints appear at transport hubs in a pattern that feels less like an emergency and more like a timetable. Posters are cleared, slogans painted over as maintenance rather than censoring. And while this distinction may be academic, it shapes how people describe the change to one another. Schools open and close on time. A kind of domestic order returns that is both comforting and instructive. The city reads meaning into choreography. If the uniforms patrol at a steady hour, if the avenue remains passable, if the radio returns to household advice and weather, then perhaps the spring can be filed as a misunderstanding, the autumn as a correction. This reading survives because it protects nerves. Against it stands the record of small removals. A lecture series is postponed until conditions are clarified. A journal misses an issue pending review. A modest exhibition is prepared, installed, and then taken down the night before opening with no explanation beyond scheduling conflict. Those engaged in cultural work learn to avoid phrases that require defense. They select verbs that carry no edges. They keep dates and leave dreams undated. The people who had been identified with changes are moved to positions where their presence carries history, but not influence. In the city's memory, this technique is familiar, and so the reactions are trained. Courteous greetings, no endorsements, no provocations, no public farewells. A compartmentalized normality comes back like an old coat that still fits. It wears at the cuffs but holds warmth. The presence of external forces remains visible enough to be a statement and restrained enough to be framed as assistance. The official narrative adopts that word, and once adopted, it is repeated. The alternative reading persists in kitchens, where gestures, a turned radio dial, a lowered voice when a certain name appears in the news, carry more analysis than whole reviews. The discipline of nonviolence that held in August yields to the discipline of not providing material for a case against oneself. People measure their days by what they do not do as much as by what they do. When the weather cools, the city's movement slows for reasons that can be attributed to season rather than policy, and this blurring serves all parties who wish to avoid spectacle. The idea that the opening might resume circulates, then dims. Visitors from allied capitals arrive in sequences that look ceremonial. They speak carefully about sovereignty, fraternity, and the necessity of cohesion. On paper, they acknowledge distinctive paths. In practice, the paths are guided to the same destination. Administrative calendars fill with coordination meetings whose outputs are summarized rather than transcribed. Notes grow thinner. Where spring had produced pages of consideration, autumn produces bullet points. In this narrowing, people adjust. Families relearn the rhythm of saying less at the table. Writers switch to topics that can hold truth without friction. Teachers emphasize skills and procedures. Students finish essays that argue for balance and order using examples that cannot be read as critique. The city's intelligence lies not in deception, but in calibration. It bends where it must to avoid breaking. Some gestures of protest persist, and they matter to those who make them, but they no longer collect mass in the avenue. Encounters with uniforms become brief and transactional. Papers are requested, provided, inspected, returned. Each transaction adds a layer to the routine. If margins still exist, they are private and measured. A person can still walk by the river at dusk and think about May. That memory does not argue with anyone. It simply exists as a comparison that cannot be placed in a file. By late autumn, what was once called an experiment is spoken of, if at all, as a phase. The term carries no accusation, which is why it survives. From conference rooms to factory floors, the day is planned in the language of stability. People who had set their watches by broadcast bulletins now set them by the time they must present identification at a checkpoint. The city enters winter with no public announcement that the season of openness has closed, and yet the position of the door leaves little doubt. From the same buildings that face the crowds in August, attention moves inward to apartments where soldiers on overnight duty are a fact of the street below, and a new register of daily life takes shape upstairs for the months ahead. Winter confirms what autumn implied. Patrols continue at hours that become habitual, and the city reconciles itself to a double ledger: the official day, which functions, and the private account, which records what is missed without issuing invoices. The presence of foreign troops shifts from headline to backdrop. Uniforms in doorways are no longer a surprise. They become wayfinding markers like statues or kiosks. Markets open with predictable cues. The grammar of politeness flourishes because it is useful. Papers are shown and returned with as few words as possible, and this brevity preserves dignity on both sides of the exchange. The tone of announcements favors reassurance. They emphasize protection, cooperation, the return of order, and the promise of steadier supplies. The alternative reading does not argue with these terms. It sees in them a boundary drawn more sharply than in spring. Two modest traces in the record help describe the adjustment. One is a transport notice that lists new inspection points at select stations, framed as improvements to safety. The other is a short note in a workplace minutes book, stating that discussion items beyond production targets are deferred to a later date, a phrase that could mean weeks or years. Such phrases take root in practical soil. People adapt their ambitions to what can be safely described as a task. Initiative does not vanish. It moves to areas where initiative is expected: repairing, scheduling, maintaining, teaching, cooking, printing the acceptable. In households, low conversations about the spring months continue, in a register that assumes no audience beyond the room. Older residents correct the sequence of events with care, less to settle the argument than to prevent the story from being simplified by the passage of time. Young people listen and sort, taking from the accounts a sense of scale rather than a plan. The street remains largely peaceful, and the peace feels designed. If dissent manifests, it does so in small gestures that do not seek to be caught. A quick chalk mark, a leaflet that appears where a hand could have brushed a wall while walking, a brief pause in a queue that forms a gap and closes again before it can be read as a statement. Institutions watch for these gestures and ask for restraint in reporting them, preferring correction to spectacle. For those whose staff desks where reporting and correcting meet, the work is repetitive and exacting. There is little appetite for making examples where a warning will suffice. The patience of the apparatus is not limitless, but it prefers order to drama, and that preference suits a city that values sleep. On the air, broadcasts regain the old cadence, announcements at the hour, music at the half, cultural segments carefully chosen to avoid sharp edges. A few voices that had sounded in spring are absent. Their absence is explained by reassignment, illness, study, or travel. The public accepts these explanations because challenging them would not change them, and because the day has many items to complete before dusk. Theaters tread familiar boards. A revived play attracts attention as an event, and some read into the staging a message that may or may not have been placed there. Reading messages into neutral objects becomes a skill. It allows listeners to think in layers without speaking them. In schools, courses emphasize reliable material. Examinations reward clarity over originality, not because originality is forbidden, but because clarity is safer to evaluate. Parents find comfort in this stability, even if they remember the spring spark with fondness. Many households make that comparison and then put it away, as one folds a scarf that no longer fits the weather. In the street-level economy, small traders adjust stock to predictable demand. Supply lines function. Shortages are handled quietly and explained as seasonal. Newspapers restore patterns of placement on the page that had defined the earlier years. The opinion column moves to its corner and stays there. The letter page retains civility and removes the language that would invite further letters of correction. Men and women who keep diaries continue to write, if more sparsely. Careful diarists note what did not happen. No large march, no overnight sweep, no abrupt closure of a place used daily. They understand that the absence of disruption is itself a shape drawn by policy. They also note a different inventory that persists despite the calm. A sign glimpsed from a tram. A rumor that a cousin has left for another city. A glance exchanged in a corridor that confirms that something is understood without being named. The coexistence of these inventories becomes the habit of the year. Visitors from other capitals comment on composure. They remark in safe rooms on the city's quiet and on the competence of its administration. They use words like orderly and responsible. Residents can accept these terms as descriptions of the surface. Beneath, they maintain their careful method for moving hope intact from one day to the next without showing it. That method is simple and not heroic. It involves work, family, a fixed schedule, and a few minutes each evening when the mind is allowed to remember May and then instructed to set that memory in a drawer. There is no admission that the drawer exists, and yet the key is never lost. If a visitor asks directly, the answer is polite and general. If the visitor is trusted, the answer is also polite and general. Trust moves slowly in a city that has learned to outlast seasons. In the final weeks of the year, the patrol routes seem to shorten by a block or two, or perhaps eyes grow used to them. The distinction is not crucial. The city does not calculate when the arrangement will shift again. It calculates how to carry the day's responsibilities under it. From this practiced balance, the scene moves toward a room where a short address will be drafted with words chosen to reassure and to certify continuity, and where the closing lines, though smooth, cannot remove the questions that have taken their place at the edge of the city's quiet. The year turns and the city presents itself as a portrait with controlled lines. Statements speak of cooperation, the safeguarding of achievements, and the careful administration of daily life. Public schedules are kept. Doors open on time. The weight of the late summer months remains present, yet it is folded into an official narrative that prizes calm and steadiness. This account stays within what can be verified from broadcast logs, meeting agendas, and press circulars that reach the street. It cannot reach voices that were not recorded, or intentions that lived only in rooms without minutes. The record allows for 2 readings that are not easily reconciled. One treats the months as a departure, corrected by necessary measures taken in support of stability within an alliance. The other treats the same months as a cautious attempt, moderated by forces whose tolerance had clear limits. Both readings can be traced in the paper trail and in the careful way residents returned to ordered days while writing privately about what those days did not include. The city's memory absorbs contradictions in order to function. It keeps the quiet scenes and the crowded avenues in the same frame without labeling one heroic or the other naive. It allows a citizen to look at a uniform and see at once an ordinary post in winter and a reminder of a halt imposed in August. That coexistence is its method for continuing without declaring closure. If hope was pressed into smaller containers, it did not vanish. It adapted to the shelves available. What then waits behind the next door that opens after a long corridor of patient steps? What documents will be signed in rooms where chairs have already been set? What words will replace others on a schedule that announces the hour? Those are questions that remain on the desk, not for lack of interest, but because the sequence has not yet been written and the pens are still uncapped.